Hi everybody. In this video, I will be talking about the anatomical record portion of the evidence of evolution lesson. Uh, in the last video, we talked about how fossils can help us explain evolution and support our idea of how natural selection plus speciation has led to all of the diversity of life that exists on Earth. Because with fossils, we actually can kind of go back in time to figure out how things were and then connect the dots, similar to what you did on the communalcule activity, right? But we can also be looking at living organisms, in particular, their anatomy, which means the way that their bodies are built. For example, in this picture, you have a human and a dog, as you can see, and humans don't usually hang out in that pose over there on the left. But if you do make a human kind of take a all fours pose, you can see that there is a lot of similarities to how our bodies are built, right? And so this is one idea that supports the evolution as an explanation, in that the chances of a human and a dog ending up with very similar skeletons is very low if they both had to come up with it on their own, if they all had to each evolve separately. But if these kinds of bones evolved a long time ago, and then all the other organisms are then the descendants of that first organism, then that makes a lot more sense in terms of probabilities. And so these things are called homologous structures, structures that might not look the same on the outside, but when you really get into it, you start to see that they are very, very similar. Two different pictures here showing a bunch of different limbs of different organisms. And the basic idea is that scientists have found, that you could find too, that all organisms that have limbs, so basically amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals, all have the same basic bones. You start with one big bone, and then two little bones, and then a whole bunch of small bones, and then fingers, right? And so obviously that's how it is in a human, but it is also how it is on a cat. Surprisingly, a whale has fingers in there and a little weird wrist. And while its one bone is really small, it's very thick and strong, it still has the one and then the two and then the many pattern, right? And so all of the pictures on this screen are illustrating the idea that that pattern has either evolved many, many times separately, or it evolved once way back with amphibians, and that all other animals are just variations on that first four-legged thing, right? So these are called homologous structures, meaning that they are from, and I'll move my face here for a second. Oh, there's nothing there. Inherited from a shared ancestor, right? It goes beyond just animals. Here's a leaf, and pine needles, right, are just really skinny versions of leaves. There's fat leaves and there's pokey leaves and all kinds of different kind of leaves. But the thing is that these leaves are all grow in the same basic way from the same basic part of the plant, just like arms grow in the same basic way from the same basic part of the animal. And everything is just a variation on itself. What's the chances that all these different leaves evolved separately, independently, and got all those mutations very similarly, or they're all sharing a common ancestor, which they do. But there are traps here. Here's our good old dolphin in the shark idea that we came across when we were starting the communalcule activity, right? If we use that same idea, the dolphin and the shark, we would want them to go together because they look the same, and we think that those things that look the same have a common ancestor. But in this case, it's a trick, because sometimes evolution repeats itself. It's called convergent evolution, as you can see, where if you have the same niche, and remember, here's these things over here on the bottom right, where we're talking about a niche, that those jobs generally require a lot of the same skills, right? If you're a burrower, you're going to need some claws that are going to help you to dig. And so it's no surprise that the mole and the marsupial mole both have these kinds of claws. If you want to be a stalking predator, you need to have all these qualities that basically a cat has. And even if you're not an actual cat, you're a Tasmanian cat, you will still have those same kinds of adaptations. And so back to the dolphins and the sharks, if you want to go fast in the water, you want to have a streamlined body, you want to have a dorsal fin, and then you want to have the tail fin to propel you. And so it makes a lot of sense that a water dinosaur, a mammal, and a shark all have the same kind of body style. But that doesn't mean that they're related, again, because a dolphin is a mammal and a dinosaur was a type of reptile and a shark is a fish. And when you get past their basic bodies, they're very, 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 very different. And so in this case, all these things have evolved to be similar just because of convergent evolution. Again, wings are a great example of this as well. A bird, a bat, and a flying dinosaur all have these wings because they need to fly, and having something that looks like a wing helps you fly. But just because you have a wing doesn't mean you're related, especially when you consider the dragonfly, which has wings, but its wings are way different than the wings of any of the other organisms, right? One thing that is similar that shows a common ancestor between these three organisms is that all these three organisms, their wings are modified arms, right? So they're, or front limbs, if you want to say it. And so they lost, especially in the birds, their front limbs and gained wings. But when you go and look at the dragonfly, it has all its regular legs in there, but its wings come out of its back, right? And there are no other animals where wings just come out of your back, which means that the dragonfly is way different on a whole different evolutionary section than these organisms, right? So we can't always just go by the surface level. Again, if you look inside the wings of the dragonfly and the bird, they look nothing alike when you start to look at bones and things like that. So those are called analogous structures. Homologous structures are the ones that actually do show us similarities, but then there are tricks called analogous structures that are just because of that convergent evolution, right? And so that's one thing that helps us to understand how things are related. Vestigial organs are anatomical structures that are no longer needed. They're things that we have, like a tailbone. Why do you have a tailbone? It doesn't serve any purpose other than to hurt you if you fall down on it, right? Tailbones, why do they exist? Sometimes people are still born with tailbones, as you can see in that picture right there. Oops. And in this case, they would probably just take that tailbone off, and they would cut that off so that you wouldn't have that, because that would be, you don't want to be the only human walking around with a tail. Maybe you do, I don't know what you're into. But the idea is that we used to have tails, right? Sometimes you could see that every once in a while when the kid is born with it. But most of us don't have tails because we don't need them anymore. And we still have the tailbone though, because once it gets inside of you, then there's no selection pressure. There's no reason for it to go away anymore because it's not hurting you. So it doesn't kill you. It doesn't take you out of the evolutionary game. And it also doesn't help you. So it's just there. Possibly there will be humans that, like this baby, will be born the opposite though, with no tailbone at all. And that wouldn't matter, right? And so if you were somebody who randomly was born with no tailbone, it wouldn't give you an advantage to have no tailbone. And therefore, that wouldn't start to spread over the generations. So again, it just sticks around. The hip bones in the whales, you saw that picture a second ago. Whales have these floating hip bones that aren't even connected to anything. They're just like inside of their fat and muscle because they used to have hips. They came from land animals. But once their hip bones became so small that they didn't cause any problems, but they also don't have any advantage for them to go away, they just stuck around because as long as it doesn't kill you, it's okay. Snakes used to have legs. These are the remnants of snake legs that are just hanging out there, right? So vestigial organs are things that point to our past. Why would they be there? Unless they used to have a purpose, but evolution has changed that purpose. Embryos, these are the very early development of babies, of course. someone noticed a long time ago that early embryos all look very, very, very similar. So for example, over here, they're not exactly 100% similar, but there are a lot of similarities. In particular, there's these blue regions. Those represent gill slits. If you were a fish, those would turn into gills. You have those same cells in you very, very early in your development. But instead of developing into gills, now they turn into some of the bones in your ear. Um, and so we all kind of start out on that same pathway, but then we have different genes, of course, which take those pathways and start to alter them. But you can see the relationships if you go to these early embryos, right? And so in some cases, like the tortoise and the chick over here, you really can't tell the difference at all when they're very young. But then, of course, when they're older, they start to get more and more different from each other. And so these are all examples of anatomical structures, body parts that hint at our evolutionary relationships to one another and our evolutionary history. And so this will help you to answer a bunch of questions that starts here, and then there's the part with those limbs, and then there's the part with the wings and the fish and this whole thing. There'll be a new video for the molecular biology part. I've had some questions about that one already, but I'll get that out to you soon, right? And so let me know if you have any questions. Email me, Google Hangouts, and good luck.